Perfect. Welcome everyone to the Oakland celebration session. It's my great pleasure to introduce this session to you. We have an interesting program for you. I must say, when I was approached a couple of weeks ago to help with this session with the amazing organization committee that put a massive amount of effort into this year's Oakland, I wondered if I would be an actual good fit, because I'm one of the more junior people here, and I haven't been around for a lot of Oakland or a lot of the symposium in earlier years. But looking back through the last 40 iterations of the symposium enabled me to gain a lot of understanding about the different ebbs and flows of the hot topics that emerged, the things that changed, and how the community actually evolved into what we are today, from a smallish workshop into this large conference or symposium that we know nowadays. It was very interesting for me to read through all of these old papers and actually experience and sample all the different things that were shown and to understand these different aspects. It was an amazing experience. I warmly recommend some of the junior folks to go through the older papers as well, because there's quite a bit that we can learn when looking back at the hot topics from a couple of years ago. Let me start with something dry and then slowly heat up. So let's look at a couple of submission statistics that we have for Oakland. And let's start with the number of accepted papers. It looks amazing, right? Bar is going right up. We see a massive increase of papers that are being accepted. This sounds great, like for authors. So we can get all of our papers accepted at Oakland. But on the other hand, if you look at something else about how the community grew over time, if you look at the number of submitted papers, we see an even sharper increase, right? So there's a massive amount of papers that are being submitted. And we as a community, we have to assess and learn how we handle these massive amount of submissions and how we can turn around papers in a reasonable amount of time, how we can review these papers. And especially if you point to trend line, we've got this exponential increase in papers here. So it's going to be even more exciting as we move on. If you look at acceptance rates, we started off fairly high, and then over the last 20 years or so, we kind of emerged at around 12 to 15% acceptance rate, more or less. Now, if you look at a trend line for those, we actually see that it doesn't look as good anymore, right? We don't have that many papers actually being accepted. So there's a somewhat negative trend line that points a bit down. But we still get an amazing program, right? We already had 1.5 days of great papers in many different topics. And part of the concessions we had to make due to this massive amount of papers that are being submitted, we switched to dual track as the first time for Oakland. There's a couple of things that have to be adjusted. And we'll see what the future will bring. Now, let's have a short look at the accepted papers. And we ran a couple of statistics. We extracted data about the authors, the papers, the titles, the abstracts, texts, and so on, and did some form of classification. And something that we recognized fairly early on when we were looking through this program, last year's programs, and so on, was the prevalence of colons. So there seems to be a foo, colon, bar, bass kind of title scheme. And we saw a massive explosion of these kind of names, of these types of titles in the Oakland papers over the last couple of years. And nowadays, more than 50% of the papers have a colon in there. So foo name, and then you follow up on with something that sounds clever and gets your paper accepted. So there was a clear change in how titles are being written over the years. Now, if you look at the length of the title, it turns out the length is fairly stable, right? And it's likely dominated by the width of the page and the size of the font. So people don't tend to get fancier with names and have like three-line titles, because that would be somewhat awkward. So we have a somewhat stable length of title. But if you look at authors, on the other hand, and author lists, there was quite an increase, right? So it started with mostly single author papers or 2 author papers. And over the last 20 years, over the last 2 decades, we saw quite a bit of new authors and more authors popping up and adding more and more expertise to single papers. That was an interesting change as well. So looking at these kind of simple statistics, what do you need to do to get your paper accepted? Well, make it a 60-character title. That seems to be a good bet. 1,500 characters abstract. 5 authors seems to be reasonable for the current setting, and add a colon to your title, although there's a little bit falling tendencies over the last couple of years. So looking back at all these massive amount of papers that we had over the last 4 decades, who are all these authors and who are the most prominent authors that we have on this list? And there's a couple of authors that pop up again and again and again. And let me name a few of them. Right, so Adrian Perrick and Don Song lead the list of Oakland authors with 21 papers. But Xiaofeng actually caught up quite a bit. He's at 20 papers this year. And especially with 5 papers this year, he caught up fairly quickly, and we'll see next year what is happening. And Adrian and Don will have to catch up to stay in the lead regarding the number of Oakland papers. Michael Bacchus has 18 papers, Chris 13, which was kind of a unhappy or unlucky circumstance because he was the chair, so he couldn't submit. Now we'll have to see how he can catch up for next year now that he has passed the baton on. And there's a cluster of 4 authors with Somesh, Engin, Mike, and Vitaly with 12 papers each, which is amazing, right? So it's an amazing feat to get so many Oakland papers accepted in there. Now, while I was doing statistics, I wondered, well, this is all nice and great, but how can I make myself look better? And I had to figure out what kind of statistics I have to apply to actually look good and show up in these rankings as well. So I found one ranking where I'm actually on the list as well, and that's the number of slams, especially if you look at other conferences as well. So who's slamming the top 4? And especially as we look at other conferences, and while Oakland was around for the longest, the other conferences, CCS, Usenik Security, and NDSS are also considered part of the top 4. And the titles or the notion of slamming the top 4 is in a single year having a paper at least one paper at each of the top 4s. And Vigna is leading this ranking with 6 slams. So for 6 years, he had at least one paper each at each of the top 4 conferences. Xiaofeng is, there's a second cluster with Xiaofeng, Giovanni, Dawn, and Chris that have 3 slams each. And myself, Fabian, Vern, and Michael, again, with 2 slams each. So apparently that's another new metric that you can use to make yourself look good. But enough of these statistics. Let's apply some machine learning to all the data that we have, right, and see what we can actually look at and what kind of information that we can gather. The first thing we did is we extracted titles, we extracted abstract, we extracted keywords, and then did some filtering based on the most common keywords that were used at Oakland during the last 40-ish years. And the main keywords that emerged, some of them were very active before, some of them are still active, are access control, information flow, multi-level security, malware and web, crypto protocols, formal methods, privacy, verification, system security, and software security. And as we grouped these kind of topics, it turned out that some of them are fairly clustered together. You don't have to read the bars on the side. It's just to show the different clusters and how they overlap. So many of the papers are somewhat close with each other. And if you cluster them according to similarity and proximity, many of them end up in a somewhat closer cluster, especially the ones that are still published or are being published in the last couple of years. We see a couple of clusters somewhat outside or far from the other topics that are no longer as active. These were 2 of the areas that were active in the 80s. One of them was multi-level security. Some of you may remember. If you don't remember, that may be a good cue to actually look it up, what it was. It was somewhat separate from these systems. And the other one was formal methods that then spawned off and turned into its own community. So we actually saw this quite a bit, that Oakland spawned interest and developed new ideas that then forked off into different communities. And these communities then emerged and became new kind of, developed their own conferences and their own systems and so on. Now, the symposium has been around for a while. Let me go through each of the 4 decades and spend a couple of minutes to tell you a bit about the vibe of these decades and what kind of, like, to give you some perspective. Right? We have a broad spread of people here, from people that were around in the 80s and people that were not around in the 80s. Right? So just to give you some perspective of how computing was at the time, let's look at the general vibe, the culture, and also the computing opportunities that we had at that times. And as we are starting with the 80s were a very particular time. It was the time of the Tron movie, the first Star Wars. We had simple games, arcade machines that you could play with. Was part of the space shuttle. Storage medium was mostly cassette drives, right, that were used to store music, or to play music off, or even to store some form of data from it. If you looked at compute systems, they were rather primitive, right? So we had 8-bit systems like the Commodore 64. We had the Apple, the first IBM machines that were, given today's standards, rather primitive and rather low end. And they were not necessarily networked, right? So they were fenced off. We had very low power compute systems. It was the beginning of the dawn of the personal computing age. And the internet was in its planning stage, right? It was the first set of computers that people were thinking about networking them together and having the first set of networks out there. Now, if you look at the topics of the 80s that were active across that time, it could be considered the security utopia. When I browsed through all the papers, it was a very upbeat kind of reading. It was like, yes, we can do this. We can fix security. Full end-to-end security is possible, and we will do it. We will use amazing techniques like formal methods and verification to solve all the security problems that the community has out there. We'll focus on foundations, have a solid theory. We'll use multi-level security, tight systems, policies to fix all these different issues. We'll have a data-secure Linux that does information flow tracking across all the different layers, provably secure operating systems, secure CPUs. The full stack will be secure and safe. So it was some form of utopia, and people were pushing towards this utopia, showing this along in their papers and systems. Now, the 90s were somewhat different, right? So the 90s saw quite a change in topics as well. And if you look at the culture, it was also a different culture, right? There was the time of the boy bands, slap-on wristbands. We saw the electronic toys like the Tamagotchi. Cameras were primitive Polaroids, so you could take instant pictures and pass them along. You had fancy games like the Tamagotchi. Phones, there were the first mobile phones. There were these ugly flip phones that you could use to call people, and not much else. Maybe play Snake, but that was it. The Game Boy started in the very late 80s, but evolved in the 90s quite a bit and allowed mobile gaming, right? So you had early compute platforms that were somewhat portable. Another part of the 80s, if you look at storage medias, is like we use disk drives, floppy disks. To the younger people in the crowd, this is what the safe icon is made from, right? That's the legacy of the safe icon. So we use this to store data. It was time of the PlayStation, more gaming, more powerful system. We had storage medias that allowed us to save a couple of 100 megabytes of data. It was the beginning of the internet, right? So you bought a browser, you paid money for it, you got the software on a couple of disk drives or floppy disks, and then you got to access the internet. It was an amazing time, right? It was the first set of the initial steps of mobile computing, as well as laptops entering the scene, and graphical user interfaces for those not working on Unix systems, right? So they saw widespread, graphical user interfaces saw widespread use. The internet got larger, got interconnected, and enabled more and more people to get online and to connect their machines into the world of the bits and bytes. And that's why you can classify and summarize the research that happened in the 90s as the internet, right? So this was the big revelation of the 90s. And you see this reflected in the research papers that show up at the symposium. A lot of research in protocols. Language-based security used to be a thing. We recognize that writing your code and your systems in C and C++ may not have been the best idea ever, and that we need some secure foundations. And that's where secure systems like Java came in. Secure systems. There were ideas like fault isolations. Software testing was the first wave of fuzzing. We just saw a session only with fuzzing papers. So the first fuzzing wave was in the 90s. But it also was a wave of covered channels. Another session we had yesterday, right? So we see these waves coming back after some time. So after the utopia in the 80s, we saw broad connectivity and the internet in the 90s. So what will the 2000s bring? Well, the 2000s saw an even a very fast digitalization, where we had the live video feeds with a slight delay from Mars. We had the first digital cameras that saw widespread use. So we no longer use the old analog film. It was the beginning of the Euro, beginning of MP3, beginning of fully digital videos or movies. The internet enabled call centers and offshore work. Also large online services like Wikipedia. We saw the beginning of social platforms like Facebook and the particular outcomes of it. We saw Skype, video conferencing. We had enough bandwidth to send moving pictures back and forth. And we got fairly massive compute power in mobile systems like in gaming systems like the PlayStation. There were video platforms like YouTube, and the internet became this all-encompassing system that allowed broad and fast connectivity across the world. Now, the 2000s, if you're looking at the topics, can be summarized as living in Cloud City to some extent. It was the explosion of cloud computing. There were virtual machines everywhere, which brought up topics like virtual machine security, cloud service security, separating systems on the cloud, isolating these different systems, and looking at these different vibes. And also, we saw the beginning of privacy when many of these large data sets were attacked or looked at by researchers, and people saw that there were actually privacy issues in there. There was also an interesting topic on open source versus security. Should you open source your implementation, potentially enabling other people to attack them? And there was an interesting panel in the 2000s. So what happened in the last decade? That's much more recent, and many of you will likely or will remember it to a large extent. The culture was the rise of CERN, drones. We saw lots of political changes. We saw first sets of tablets. And was also another wave of Star Wars movies that came out, right? And apparently, avocado toast was a big thing, according to the Wikipedia page on the cultural aspects of it. We also saw Bitcoin, which was a big change in security and also the public sector. We saw mobile computing. Like, instead of these clunky devices that lasted for half an hour, we now all have smartphones that are much more powerful than even the computing system we had in the late 90s on our systems. It was the beginning of the large privacy leaks and observation. And also the beginning of internet in planes. So now you can get internet everywhere from mobile systems, from on planes and at home, right? So it's everywhere and you're always connected. The main topics that we saw in the last 10 years are blockchain related. So it's a big chain machine learning that came up, and machine learning and security aspects, analysis and study of data sets that are out there, along with JIT browser exploitation and measurement studies. So the key ideas, or some of the key ideas are crime and human data flows that intersect and interact with each other, distributed computing, the continuation of cloud computing, cloud services, and different forms of data privacy that now starts to encompass all of our lives. After this short overview, let's have a quick look at some of the people involved in Oakland that keep making Oakland greater and more competitive and allow it to keep the top spot at the security conferences. There's 44 hardworking PC chairs in 40 years. So there's a minimum amount of PC chairs of 1, a maximum of 3. "38 of those served for 2 years each, and thanks for the applause for everyone. But that's not all, right? Now that it was the first time that I was in such a large, involved in the organization of such a large conference, and although I was only doing a very, very, very small part of it, I saw how many people work on it in the background. And I'm deeply in awe of all the work that all the general chairs have to do. And there were 30, yeah, applause. Of these 37 hardworking general chairs in 40 years, and some people even did both. They served as PC chair and as general chair. So the massive amount of service for these large conferences is really, really impressive. And yeah, it's amazing to see them work for a year to make these conferences here happen. A quick note on the sources. So I used a lot of the data from Davide Balzarotti's System Security Circus. If you're interested, you can browse it and check out the statistics. There's 2 amazing write-ups of the first 3 decades by Peter Neumann and Sean and Marvin. And there's the 2 articles that I warmly recommend. Thanks to all the previous and current chairs that helped me put all of this information together. The CTF teams that helped create all the challenges, like the Purdue Boilers, the EPFL Polyglots, and the UC Santa Barbara Shellfish CTF teams that created many of the challenges and helped run the CTF. If you haven't done so, there's still time. The CTF is still running until tomorrow at noon. There's going to be amazing prizes. The URL for the CTF pops up every now and then. It's also on the page of the Oakland 40 celebration at the symposium webpage. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and hand over to Giovanni, who will be running the panel on reflections on 4 decades of the symposium. Please, Giovanni, come up on stage. And thank you all for listening.